This was just last year, March 2018 in fact. I had just moved from New York to Vermont and decided to rent a home for a couple of months that allowed my cat and dog while I waited to close on my new home in Vermont. Last year it was snowy, and this house was located up a small mountain off of a dirt road. If 10 cars passed on the road during the day, that was a busy day. I thought it was closer to the village when I first booked it through Zillow, but I wasn't looking to go anywhere really, but instead to heal, rest up and relax from what had been an already really exhaustive packing ordeal and moving experience. I had some guy friends who helped me get up there, and they left after one night. I was told now not to let my dog run without a leash, as there were a few alpacas at the next door farm who might attack my dog, which was at least 1/8 of a mile walking distance away. Not that my aging dog was going anywhere too fast. He was 16 or 17 at the time and can barely walk anymore. He was one of those really awesome great dogs you may be lucky to have once or twice in your life. Got along with anyone or anything. The next neighbor after that was at least a mile down the road. As I settled into this lovely one-story home, the house had automated motion detectors that would light up the driveway that ran behind the house. There stood a huge ancient apple tree that still has a few apples on it way high up, even in March, and your usual pine and birch trees surrounding the property. The large front and back lawn areas, being several acres inside, are surrounded by forests and old rock walls. I grew up in an area in New York where I was surrounded by trees and forests, so I wasn't spooked any until that second night. The house had a large pond out front which was covered in ice and snow. There was literally at least 4 feet of snow on the ground, with just enough of the driveway plowed to get your car in and out. I backed my car by the back door. There were several outbuildings too on the property. One building in particular was perhaps 30 feet from the back door of the house that you go through the kitchen to get to. In this open garage-like building, it looked to be used as a large garden storage area. There was no door, just an open area. Off the kitchen was a screened-in porch that faced the pond out front. This is important to the story later on. So, on that second night, I take my dog, put him on the leash. It's 8 p.m. and pitch black outside. Fresh, fluffy snow of about 1 foot has fallen, and me being a silly New Yorker with just sneakers on without any socks, I'm in my nightgown and a light jacket. I walked out the back door with my dog in tow, thinking I'd only be outside for 5 minutes. I walked him slowly to do his business, as I was soon ready to get to bed. As I returned to the door, I soon realized I had inadvertently locked myself out of the house. It was those types of doorknobs that if you twist it in one direction, it will lock itself. Now, I tried not to panic, but it was cold. And there I am looking silly, and thought perhaps, well, I could walk to the neighbor's house. But I had no flashlight, no cell phone, and felt I would break an ankle trying to manage the walk in the dark. That's when I remembered I saw something in that open garage-like building. It was a crowbar. I thought, well, I could do one of those MacGyver moves. I've seen enough window break-ins on TV. And went to take my dog's leash and tie it around my car's left mirror. I knew I would not only be losing my deposit at this point, and have to pay for the damage, but heck, I'm stuck outside with no key in freezing temperatures without any way to even get to my car to stay the night with the dog. I go grab the crowbar, and with a little hesitancy, and then with full vigor, I took said crowbar facing away, swung at the glass window as hard as I could. It bounced off the glass, making the loudest sound that just echoed in the night air. It even sparked. I was like, what the hell is that? Now, first of all, what kind of window doesn't break? Mind you, I'm a strong gal, but this was like bulletproof glass or safety glass. Then I thought, well, since perhaps it's a safety feature, so let me try another window. I chose one just to the left. After surveying, I could probably get to climb in, and again, same issue. I was like, okay, forget this, there's got to be another solution. That's when I remembered the screened-in porch that's off the kitchen, and I thought, well, perhaps if I can get to the screened porch door that leads outside, and if the door to the kitchen was still unlocked, then I would only have to pay for a ripped screen, much cheaper to repair than a broken window. I go look around, and there's at least 15 feet of a long path of snow that must be cleared for me to even access that screen door. I go to the garage and grab the shovel I saw earlier. My hands and legs are getting colder with every moment. I start to clear the snow, shoveling as fast as I can. All the time, my dog is barking because he can't see me around the corner. His barks echo off the back mountain that's beyond the forest in the backyard. I keep yelling at him to quiet down. When I no longer hear him, I don't think too much about it because I've got to get inside and figured he had just calmed down a bit. Finally, I reach the screen door and am super grateful it's unlocked. I squeeze my way through, pushing more snow out of the way, and make my way to access the kitchen door, hoping all the while I haven't locked this door to the house. And wow, it's unlocked. I am so relieved at this point. I run through the kitchen to go back out the door from which I got locked out to get my dog. Not without grabbing the keys this time. I look at the mirror of the car and my dog is not there. His leash just hangs there and it looks like it's been torn. I start to freak out, like I need any more trouble tonight. I start to walk around to the back of the house and there's my old dog, happily having done his business, just waddling his way back to me. I am one very relieved chick. The leash I tie into a knot so I can reuse it the next day. It's one of those retractable leashes made for dogs that are over 100 pounds and it's at least an inch wide. How he tore or chewed through that so quickly, I often wonder. So finally, I get to bed and vow never to leave that house ever without the keys in my hand. The next night is when Bigfoots decide to tell me that they're in the neighborhood. I go out again around 8 p.m. and it's a clear night sky and I'm staring up at the stars in disbelief at just how pretty this all is. I am seeing constellations I haven't seen in years living in New York. I am standing at the back of the house in front of a large picture window that looks out towards that backyard and mountain, with that open garage at my 3 o'clock position to my right. I wasn't there for but 1 or 2 minutes when I heard the first knock at the 2 o'clock position, and another one coming from the 11 o'clock position from where I am standing. They were single, very clear one-knock noises, very much just like the ones I had made the night before while trying to get back into the house by trying to break back into the house through the windows, loud and clear. When I heard those noises, they were very distinctive. I know the sounds of trees make when they sway, and this wasn't trees swaying in any way. In fact, there was no wind at all that night. You know, I hightailed it back inside the house in seconds flat, and I locked all the doors. The next night, I'm thinking I'm okay, but what would happen next scared me to bits. I'm doing the usual routine of walking the dog just down the driveway some. I've learned by now where the lights are for outside, so I make sure they are all on. It's icy out and I'm using a sky pole to help me walk safely with a flashlight. And of course, the house keys are in my jacket pocket, while I walk the dog for his last evening walk. As I start to return to the back kitchen door, I look beyond that open garage outbuilding because a pop of color caught my eye. That's when I saw a pair of really large red eyes looking back at me at the edge where the yard ends with a rock wall abutting the forest. At first, okay, perhaps an owl? As I continue to look, I move and shift my body left to right, thinking perhaps it's something of a reflector that's catching the lights from the house. I would be good with that explanation. But no. It was eyes. Big red-orange eyes staring straight and watching me. What got me most was how wide apart they were. This was about 100 to 120 feet from where I was standing. Those eyes looked like they were at least 10 inches apart. I didn't even want to imagine how big whatever I was looking at could be. I stood there for at least a minute because I was waiting for it to move, until I couldn't comprehend what I was looking at. So yeah, I scurried back into that house. The next day, I went out and looked again at that area from which I saw eyes looking back at me. Looked carefully, even venturing out, it was daylight, in the deep snow for roughly 30 feet to see if perhaps it was something like reflectors or tin cans or anything that could have reflected that light back. I saw nothing. Absolutely nothing. I grabbed the binoculars that were inside and went back out again, and there was nothing. Except for the rock wall, the forest and sounds of birds chirping happily. As I stayed there for 3 or 4 more weeks, I never saw those eyes or whatever was reflecting again. This isn't my first experience with a possible Bigfoot, as I have several others, but those happened in New York. One day, I will post those. But yes, people, there is something odd up in those mountains in Chester, Vermont, and it wasn't a mountain lion, and it wasn't a wolf or a coyote. But to hear that knocking, and then those big red glowing eyes that next night, I kept my night walking the dog very short after that, and never left the house after dark for any other reasons. I can assure you, I felt like I was being watched several times after those first few nights. I didn't fear anything, but it was more like they were curious and watching out, quite literally. And the kicker? There was a key hanging right above the shovel I grabbed that first night that would have gained my access back into the house immediately. And yes, I got my entire security deposit back. I adored that house, by the way, and haven't shared this story very much. I hope you enjoyed my true encounter from March of 2018. When I was young, I was into anything unexplained, including Bigfoot, UFOs, Nessie, Bermuda Triangle, etc. So I've always had an open mind about unexplained things. In my teenage years, I thought much more about sports, music, and girls, that I had kind of put my interest in the back of my head. Until one weekend in 95 or 96. I am recalling this as best as my memory serves me. Quick background. I lived in very rural Colorado at the time, but my uncle lives in Denver, and he and his then wife had bought a cabin outside Fairplay, which is where the old town of South Park City is. It had just been made a minor tourist attraction by the show, but it was nothing but some old buildings and a sign on the edge of Fairplay. The cabins were really just modern houses built out in the woods with a bit of a rustic look to them. This cabin had a large wood patio around the back and down one side, large glass windows, and motion sensor lights. It was a 2-story with a high balcony outside one of the rooms, which faced a thicket of pine and aspen trees that was actually about 10 to 15 feet up as the ground sloped away from the house on that side. I was 16 or 17 at the time, but still in high school. Over the 4th of July, my uncle invited my family up to the cabin for a few days. We arrived at dusk on the 2nd. As soon as I got out of the car, I felt a massive uneasiness come down on me like a blanket. I honestly felt scared or in danger, like I was in a bad neighborhood or something, standing right next to my parents and aunt and uncles, and they were completely oblivious. So I asked my little brother, and he said he felt it too. When I asked him what he thought it was, he just blurted out, "Bigfoot," as if the word came to him before the thought was actually in his head. That night, everything went fine, and the next morning, the uneasiness lifted, so we went out exploring the woods around the house. We found some little stick structures and some snapped-off trees, as well as one that could have been uprooted in the middle of the cluster of trees. I knew that no human could have done that, and a bulldozer couldn't have reached it, nor the wind knocked it over without affecting the trees directly around it. Unfortunately, it had been really dry, so I did not see any tracks, and this predated digital photography, so I don't have any pics. That afternoon, the uneasiness returned, and by nightfall, I was downright scared, but surrounded by adults, so I pretended to be fine. My cousin, brother, and I slept in the living room that night, with all the adults in bedrooms upstairs. The large windows in the living room opened to the wood patio and had thin curtains. I was having a hard time sleeping, though my brother and cousin didn't. Sometime in the middle of the dead calm night, the motion sensor lights came on. There was no sound, no wind. Even the neighbor's dog, which had been loud all day, was silent. After a few minutes, they turned off, and then came on again several times. I did not dare peek out of the windows, but I pretty much didn't sleep that night. I was about 6 foot, 165 pounds, played every sport that I could, hiked tons, fished, hunted, and spent lots of time by myself in the woods. I had been around deer and elk, as well as moose, and I had seen bears in the wild before. Yet, here I was, in a secure house with 6 adults under the same roof, but as scared as a baby, wishing one of them was in the room with me. The fear was almost paralyzing. I wouldn't even use the bathroom because I was worried something would look into the window, and that made for a long night. The next morning was the 4th, and everything felt fine again. We poked around some more, but I didn't really want to stray too far from the house. We saw a few more things, but nothing significant. That afternoon, some more people showed up for a party, but rain came very heavy off and on, so we didn't do fireworks. In the early afternoon, I felt so uneasy I was about to crawl out of my skin, so we went inside. We borrowed some binoculars and decided to go out on the upper balcony to see what we could see. I tried to pinpoint where I felt the uneasy vibe from and focused the binoculars on that area in the trees. I was zoomed in and trying to focus the lens on this one aspen when I noticed I was seeing a dark shape behind it. As I was coming to the realization of what my eyes were seeing, matted fur, sticks and leaves stuck to it, the shape of a shoulder, it moved. I almost dropped the binoculars and shuddered out, "I just saw Bigfoot!" My brother and cousin both took a turn looking. One of them said they saw the face and it was similar in texture and structure to a gorilla. The other said he saw it in the side profile as it was looking out to the clearing next to the house. We all agreed on what we saw, but all of us were too scared to go back outside, or even take another look. We also didn't tell any adults because we didn't think they'd believe us. It still amazes me in the situation that I saw what I believed could have been proof of their existence, yet I didn't do anything to get concrete evidence. I could have told my uncle or dad or asked to borrow a camera because my uncle is a photographer, but the fear was just so overwhelming I couldn't even think of looking at it again, much less venturing into the woods after it. We left the next morning, and it was a few years before I told my dad about it. He didn't give me any crap. He only said he felt there was so much wilderness in the US that it was conceivable to him for a North American ape to exist, yet elude mankind. My uncle, who I told later, said he wished I had told him so he could have started looking because he hiked and fished around there all the time. They sold the cabin years ago, but in the last 2 years, they were print cast about a mile or two from the cabin near 4 Mile Creek. Now that the internet has made it available for more people to communicate their personal stories and findings, I feel much more confident telling the story, and the behavior patterns seem to fit, with the creature being interested in only kids at the house. I'm not sure why none of the adults could feel it, but I still get hairs on the back of my neck standing up just thinking about it. I never felt fear that potent. Yet I didn't necessarily feel threatened directly, just scared of something huge that was aware of me and could have kidnapped me if I wanted to. I also attributed the uneasiness that I didn't feel in the morning, but coming on in the afternoon, to the sleep pattern of that particular Bigfoot, and it possibly watching us out of curiosity in the afternoon and into the evening. He goes to an undisclosed location in North Carolina quite regularly and camps with our friends. One night, they were all sitting around the fire in the middle of camp, doing what campers do, and a rock came in at an angle. It was bigger than a golf ball and smaller than a baseball. At first, he thought nothing of it, and then another one came in and his dog was starting to look off into the woods. so he picked it up and threw it back into the woods. About 5 minutes went by, and another rock came flying in. This time it was much closer to him and about the same in size. His dog and another dog that was there were starting to bark off in the direction that it came from. Again, he picked it up and threw it back, and then nothing happened until they went to bed. At about 2 or 3 a.m., the dogs started going crazy inside the tent, and they heard loud noises coming from outside. A lot of beating and banging around something was going on through their camp. At about 2 or 3 a.m., the dogs started going crazy inside the tent, and they heard loud noises coming from outside. A lot of beating and banging around. Something was going through their camp. He and his friend hopped up and grabbed their guns, but were too freaked out by what was going on at the time from earlier. When they got up in the morning, after not much sleep that night, the campsite was a total mess. I can't say for sure what it was there. The activity after they went to bed could have very well been a bear, but the rock throwing is what has me curious. The next trip out, I plan on going with them to see what I can find. I personally am an optimistic skeptic, and my friend did not think they were real until this happened. Now he believes. So, I believe it was May 13th, 2012. I had taken a train to Olympia, Washington, and then hitchhiked the rest of the way to Westport, Washington, because I wanted to learn to surf. I'm experienced in the outdoors and hitchhiking semi-regularly. Anyway, after renting a surfboard and flailing around in the water for the day, it was getting close to sunset and I had to find a place to sleep. I found out that it was illegal to sleep on the beach, which is state land, but someone suggested I go down to Grayland State Park, which was just south of where I was. Not only did I have the option of paying for a campsite, but I could also find a place to lay my stuff down. I had a ground tarp, a sleeping bag, and my wetsuit, and sleep without being bothered. Now in May, the weather is windy and the water is freezing. Surfing was unpleasant, and this beach is pretty empty, except for a few summer homes, etc. So that's what I did. I hitchhiked down Highway 105 to the park, decided against buying a campsite, and hiked through the woods to the beach. The wooded area between the highway and the beach is probably only a couple 100 yards deep, but the trees aren't very tall and form a thick canopy, somewhat claustrophobic. I found a couple small landmarks, a certain rock, a beach marker with a streamer on it, to remember where my things were, and set them down. I grabbed a sandwich from my bag and went back to the campsite area so I could charge my phone in the bathroom. I was surprised at how empty the area was. There was one RV with the blinds down, and a couple fast asleep in one campsite. Otherwise, it was deserted. As I sat, disappointed that the bathroom had no electricity, I smoked a long cigar and enjoyed my time alone. Night had fallen. It was bedtime. I began to walk back towards my impromptu beach camp when I realized I could not see a damn thing. The moon was relatively bright, but the wind was intense and the forest canopy blocked any moonlight. I continued walking west through the trees with my hands out in front of me so I didn't hit anything. At this point, I was creeped out. Dark, empty woods at night are creepy. Howling wind that covers any other sound is creepy. But I pressed on because I'm more adventurous than that. Besides, the beach was easy to find. Just walk west until you reach the Pacific. Big ocean, can't miss it. I came out onto the beach, and none of my landmarks were there. I might have gone a bit north or south, I don't know, but I thought the dim light from my cell phone screen could help me find that weird rock near the edge of the woods. I went back into the forest. Never had I thought I could be so lost in such a small area. I couldn't have been more than a half a mile from my things. Yes, the woods are creepy, but I'll hang in there. Until the scream. Directly behind and to my right, the most startling Bigfoot scream I have ever heard came out. I jumped, swore, and began to run. I didn't know what that was, and I didn't want to find out. I couldn't run too fast because I couldn't see. The noise continued, although I was getting further from it. That was encouraging. I ran a little faster until I slammed my left shoulder into a tree I didn't see. Barely catching myself, I slowed down despite the adrenaline. As I slowly walked, feeling tree trunks and trying not to trip over rocks, I remembered reading that this area contained screeching owls. Those aren't scary. Eventually, I came back to the beach, wandered up and down until I found my stuff, and went to sleep. Well, shit, I thought. Screech owls are startling. That was 2 summers ago. Earlier this year, after getting interested in Bigfoot, I was telling someone my story, and they asked if I could send them a recording of a western screech owl, so I googled it. I couldn't actually find a recording that matched what I heard. Screech owls have several calls, but this was not one of them. Weird, I thought. Then later, I found out that Grays Harbor County, which was where I was at, has some of the highest numbers of BFRO reports in all of Washington state. What I heard wasn't the famous whoop howl, but it was very similar in pitch and unbelievably loud. I'd hardly call a scary noise in the woods proof of an undiscovered ape or being, but that's my story. I didn't see, but smell the Bigfoot. I don't give a shit if one of you believe me. Riding motorcycles 20 miles into Lake Shasta logging roads, I was left behind by my faster friends. I was doing 15 or so, and boom! I was hit by a smell that hit me on a primordial level. Dear God, imagine 1,000 cab drivers plus 1,000 wet dogs rolled in shit and left to rot. It's like I knew that an apex predator was near, and my fight or flight response kicked in like it never has. Gassed it? You bet. How do I know it wasn't a bear? You just know. I can't and won't try to explain it. If you ever encounter one, you will know exactly what I mean. It was like the first time I had sex. The smells involved turn you on and you realize you are an animal. This was similar in that you feel it in your gut and accept your fate. It's addictive, and I want that feeling again, which explains the TV shows to me. You're just looking for that first feeling again. Two nights ago, my husband went to take the dogs out back. My one dog started barking like crazy right away. My hubby had a flashlight and quickly scanned the grass line where the woods start. Where we normally see deer, our house is bordered by woods. Something made him shine a bit higher, and he sees 2 eyes staring back at him, about 9 feet off the ground. As my husband tries to hurry, the dog's back inside. He sees the thing turn and casually walk back into the woods, like a man, with arms and shoulders. I have never seen my husband so freaked out. He came inside and closed every single window and all the blinds, and refuses to let the dogs out in the backyard at night anymore, period. In hindsight, there have been a few instances in the past few weeks that we can't explain, like dog toys being down by the woods with bites taken out. But it was the placement of the toys and whatnot that makes us wonder. Also, a grunt/snort noise we heard recently. My husband cannot get over the size of this thing, and the fact that the eyes were so high off the ground. I asked him if he thought he saw Bigfoot, and he said after a minute or so of silence, "If I wasn't a believer before, I sure as hell am now." We moved away the next summer, but just moved back into the house on June 1st. I have a trail cam posted in the yard, but I have yet to get anything on it. We live in the upper peninsula of Michigan, near the Michigan-Wisconsin border. I've always been interested in the idea of a North American ape. I'm not convinced that they exist, and I haven't ever seen one. But I have no doubts that something fitting the description could survive quite handily across the country. I have had one experience that's left me confused, so here it goes. I've always been an avid outdoorsman. I've always hunted and fished. I'm from Missouri, and I know what we have and what we don't have. What we have are a few mountain lions scattered around and even fewer black bears. The only common things that are big and wild are deer, coyotes, and turkeys. And that being said, I really enjoy deer hunting. Our farm is situated on bluffs and ridges along the Missouri River in the center of the state. And while it's actually pretty populated, the terrain is incredibly rough and hard to get around on. That being said, our acreage isn't huge, but the surface area is. All kinds of ravines, gullies, hollows, etc. It was a few years ago when I was halfway through undergrad and went home on a weekend during bow season. So it's a half-hour drive from the house to the farm, and I show up well before daylight. And, as luck would have it, I forgot my keys to my dad's box stand, since we keep it locked so the neighbors don't vandalize it. That didn't bother me much though, because like I said, rough terrain. It isn't hard to find a spot that sits over a game trail where I can have some elevation and cover. And I grew up around this farm, so I knew where trails were. All I had was a pack with some stuff like a knife and rope and tags, my bow, and a little LED flashlight. I took off down the side of a ridge and found a good spot where I could lean against a tree that overlooked a trail with some brush in front of me for cover. Figured I'd wait for the sun to come up and a doe would come by and I'd be home with the deer by lunchtime. I got to the spot, set down my pack, nocked an arrow, and of course turned off my light. I got there probably too early and there was no sign of daylight yet, especially considering how thick the woods were. I had been standing there for a half an hour, maybe 45 minutes, and then I heard a pack of coyotes. Like I said, not unusual, we have those. What I didn't like was that I was on the ground with only a bow, in the dark, and the yips and howls were only getting closer. It would be a real pain in the ass to accidentally surprise a pack of coyotes like that. I have never heard of them bothering people, but you know how surprised animals freak out. So I was getting ready to maybe arrow a coyote and was listening intently to where they were. As they came closer, I noticed something bigger was with them. My initial thought was that they were chasing a deer. I could hear leaves like crazy and some limb snapping and stuff like that. Once again, that all makes sense, and I had decided that it was a big deer, maybe two of them together. They were really tearing up the leaves as they came, and the yipping and howling was right there with them. They must have passed me, maybe 30 or 40 yards farther down the hillside, went right on by without noticing me at all. They were in a hell of a hurry too. Before I could even think of estimating the time, I had lost the sound of the coyotes in the ravines and the woods. So you know, I kind of eased up then. Probably wasn't going to shoot anything for a while yet, and if anything came around at all. And then, right then when I was relaxed, I heard this whoop coming from right behind me. I don't think I've ever jumped up, spun around, and drawn a bow so fast. Of course, you can't handle a bow and light at the same time, so I was stuck there, in the dark, with something whooping right behind me, and with only a bow. You can imagine I was a little tense. After about a minute, I let off the draw, but I kept my release on the string. I didn't move for another hour, not till I could see a ways without a light. After the sun came up enough, I walked out very slowly and kept looking behind me. I got the truck and went home. I was totally done hunting for the weekend. So what was it? Like I said, I've been in those woods my entire life and I have never heard anything like that. I thought about owls and looked up every owl call I can find and none of them were like that. The only thing that I've heard that sounds like it are supposed Bigfoot vocalizations. So then that makes me wonder, was a pack of coyotes chasing a Sasquatch? Not likely. So then I thought, well, what if the Sasquatch was chasing the coyotes, either to kill them out of spite or to kill them for food? At any rate, the whole thing was weird. I would have never even thought it was remotely possible for something like that to be found in Missouri and so close to civilization. Of course, after I did some Googling, I found other cases of Missouri sightings, and a lot of them. A friend and I were hiking not far from downtown Salt Lake City in July of 2014. After a while, we decided to rest a bit. It was around 5:15 p.m. Since the trail was narrow and crowded with bush, we left the trail to rest under some very tall fir trees, where the bushes were less thick, but it was still shady. July in Salt Lake is close to 100 degrees. As I was leaning on a stump, I noticed that we were standing among several trees that formed a teepee shape. As we were noticing and discussing it, I heard a loud crash and then a twig snap just a few yards in front of me. My back was to the trail, so I was facing a hillside and deeper forest growth while my friend was facing the trail with his back towards the hillside. The trees in the teepee formation were to my right about 10 feet and where my friend was facing them and the trail. So my head was turned about 90 degrees when I heard the commotion coming from the base of the hillside. I immediately looked toward the sound and saw a hominid covered with dark brown hair moving quickly behind the thick bushes. He wasn't more than 6-ish feet tall, and I didn't get a good look at his face because he turned and moved so quickly. I noticed that his hair was two-toned, with the darker hair on his head and shoulders and the lighter hair on his midriff. His legs appeared darker. I shouted, "Did you see that?" to my friend while trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The last time I saw someone tromping through the bushes in that area was in early spring. There were 2 ex-country skiers coming back down the mountain. The one in front was wearing a blue jacket with the typical two-tone dark gray shoulder pattern. So for some reason, it was the first explanation that my brain had come up with for what I was seeing there in July. I mean, I could clearly recall the hairy creature. But at the same time, my brain was refusing to believe it and was trying to come up with a scenario for the situation. All it could muster was a skier hiking through the forest, not on the trail but fully dressed in dark ski clothes from head to toe, in July. At any rate, I then began to call out, "Hello? Hey! Hello?" while also trying to listen for the direction of his retreat between my calls. My friend ran up to the spot to see if he could see anything. He had only seen a blur by the time he had even turned all the way around to see what had made the sound, so he wasn't even sure what we were looking for. Even though it was only a few short yards to where the spot was and where we saw our skier, there was nothing there. I regained my senses and ran to see if there were any tracks. I found one, but it resembled more of the kind of print you'd find in the deep sand, more of a dugout type of depression in the needles. I measured it from side to side, and it was in about an inch longer and wider on each side than the size 11 sandals I was wearing. I hadn't heard any crashing through the bushes after the initial noise that grabbed my attention, so I was unable to determine what had happened to the skier after it had passed behind the bushes. There were small green plants covering the ground in the direction he went, but they were only compressed and then quickly ran out at the edge of a very small and gentle ravine running back up the hill. We scanned for tracks, but I didn't feel like pursuing into the deeper brush or up the ravine, so we went back to the trail. I made a short video of the track that I'll try to post, but it's not impressive quality. I'm going back to video the tree structures as well, and will post that when I get it. Oddly, neither of us felt threatened in the least, and although the valley we were hiking up was very narrow, we just continued up the trail in the same direction our furry friend had gone. We thought we had heard movement up a hillside a few times and from various directions, but still never felt threatened. After an hour or so of high awareness hiking, we turned back so we wouldn't get caught up there after sundown. After giving it some thought, I found it highly suspicious that this creature had so quickly moved through the brush without any noise except for the initial crash. I wonder now if the noise was a deliberate attempt to get our attention, not as a trap, but rather as an alert. A sort of, "Hey, we're here, please respect our space." I'm never going to hike there alone again, that's for sure, but I'm definitely going back up there with a friend or two. I'd like to look for more indications of an individual or family group. If a group has moved in, I'd like to know. Otherwise, I might assume it was just a male passing through. I was out hunting with my dad, and he had put me on a post. I had been there for about an hour and a half when I saw what I thought to be a deer, and it turned out to actually be an elk. After about 2 minutes, the elk took off fast. I then heard faint footsteps off in the distance. Now, the footsteps were not loud. I was watching to see what it was. And that's when I think I saw a Bigfoot. This animal looked to be at least 8 feet tall, and I never saw any legs because of the bushes in the way, but I did see one arm. The arm looked like they could have been 3/4 the length of the animal. I went back to the same area 2 days later and saw what looked like just the front half of a footprint. It was a shallow footprint. I went back that afternoon to take a mold of it, but the print was gone. I still don't know what I saw, but I know it was nothing I'd ever seen before or since. My first experience happened in 1986 or 1987, when I was almost 12 years old. I was living in Berry County in Missouri then, outside of Cassville, about 8 miles to the southeast of a town in a place called Mineral Springs. The house was situated on top of a very high hill, and below, deep in a steep valley, was a natural spring that is still there today. Behind that house and the one next door were patches of field before it turned to the woods that dropped into the valley. If one were to follow the road further southeast, it would drop steeply into Rock House Valley, which spans for a very good stretch. At the base of the hill is a field, and you can enter the valley that way too. On this particular August day, my older brother and I decided to take a morning hike. We went down the road, down that steep drop we called Mineral Hill, and ended up at the bottom. We asked the old farmer if we could cross his pasture and climb the bluffs up onto the hill. We easily could have just hiked the valley, but what's the fun in that? The terrain up there was spongy, like all the trees had nowhere to root all of a sudden and just fell over and left pockmarks on the tops of the hills. It was strange. We found a deer trail and went northeast and followed it for a while before we veered back to the west. We were about 3 hilltops back, and we saw 2 very large rock stacks on that hilltop. I would say they were at least 3 feet tall, and my brother told me to steer clear because of snakes. I did steer clear, but as soon as we went beyond the stacks, I started to feel uneasy. Back then, I didn't know what to make of it. It was like we'd crossed a boundary, and I just felt odd. We stopped on the other side of the hill, on the slope, so we could eat lunch. I don't remember conversation, but I know he finished first and started down the slope without me. I'm a slow eater as it is, so I finished by the time he got to the bottom. I don't remember what he was doing down there. I just know that as soon as I stood up, something behind me jumped into the leaf litter, about 50 feet away, or maybe took a heavy step. But at that time, I thought something jumped into the leaves from a tree. That's just how I rationalized it. I thought maybe it was a raccoon. I felt an overwhelming sense of being watched, but for the life of me, as I stood there, I couldn't see a thing. I peered down deep into the valley where my brother was and yelled at him to wait for me. I started scrambling down the hill. You're talking a good 50-degree or steeper grade on that hill. I heard noise behind me and my brother was walking away from me, and I had to keep going. I still feel that panic from that moment when I write this. I cannot tell you just how choked up I felt. Something was following me, keeping pace on 2 feet, and I couldn't see it. When I got to the creek bottom and the valley floor, I had to catch up to my brother, and I was still being followed. By then, I was pretty excited when I reached him, and I told him something was following me. I heard it. He discounted me and said it was an animal or something. He had his pellet gun. He wasn't worried. Oh my, looking back on it now, how useless that gun was. We started on and then heard the footsteps. He too looked and saw nothing. There was one point there that I remember him getting ticked off and yelling at it, and he shot his pellet gun in the general direction of steps. I kid you not, we couldn't see a thing. We only heard it moving away from us and ahead of us. When it was gone, he relaxed, but I was still spooked. Close to the spring, but not quite, there was a pool of water, and he decided to wash up. It was hot out. I waited there on the bank and looked down, and then I saw them. The footprints. I'd seen my dad's books, but I thought they only lived in Washington, which is a world away. I said his name in a squeak, and he came over and I pointed down. The print was large, well over a foot long, at least 6 inches wide, and had 3 toes. And besides, it was a smaller one, maybe from a baby or something, but they were close, especially the way they were walking. The grass inside the larger print was at least a foot deep, and was still bent over, smashed down. My brother freaked out, ran up the hill, and left me there. I didn't want to be left behind. I started crying and was screaming for him to wait for me. When we got to the house, we were both upset, and we told our parents. Dad called his buddy to come out, and they dragged me down there, and when they had the print in sight, I went back up the hill and straight home. They found more prints out there, followed the prints a mile and a half down the valley. For sure, they'd been following my brother and I. They made casts and brought them back. Now, all summer we'd heard screams, and the animals were all silent. It had been an odd summer, so I guess they'd been down there all that time. The story doesn't end there, though. My sister and I shared a bed in the back bedroom situated on the northeast side of the house. I'm a light sleeper, and I have trouble getting to sleep as it is. I slept on the wall side of the bed, next to the window. I lay there, facing the wall and window. My knees were about level to the window, which was about 6 feet from the ground, perhaps. It was then, as I lay there awake, staring at the wall, that I heard something behind the house, walking up, like a straight line. Not shuffling about or anything, but directly to the window it came. Heavy, heavy footsteps, and I knew then what it was. I knew it was what had followed us in the valley. It came right up to the window and very close too. It just stood there, and I lay there looking at the window, knowing what was on the other side. I couldn't move. I was just too afraid. I didn't understand them. To have the experience again, I might have sat up and looked. A good 5 minutes passed, and he, she, or whatever it was, backed up and walked back down into the valley. That was 17 years ago, but it seems like yesterday. For the past 12 years, I have been researching Sasqautch and have obtained about 20 stories in that county alone, around Star City and Roaring River. I never thought I'd have another experience again, but on a hike by Roaring River to explore an area where a female was seen that chased a guy I heard rock knocking and was parallel on the trail back to my vehicle, I wasn't afraid then. I knew what was following me that time, and I remained calm. 2 years ago, in the heavy sighting area around Star City, where my mother lives, I pulled into her driveway one Friday night. It was the early springtime because my baby was only a few months old, and he was born in January. Mom's yard faces a tree line, and the yard is lined with a deep creek. As soon as I got out of my vehicle, I knew I was being watched. I had heard heavy breathing, just like you and me, only deeper and louder. It was a staring contest at whatever was concealed in the dark brush. But I am just a small woman, so you know, not too awfully brave. It is my contention that they are human, not animals, and that as being a type of human that they have the potential to be good or bad. What I felt coming from it was plain irritation. I'd invaded the observation. I was frozen there, maybe 2 minutes, and I hurried back into the truck and got the baby, and I backed up toward the house and went in without knocking. There are so many stories around here that I could tell, and perhaps I'll post those too. The southeast Momo has nothing on southwest Missouri. The year was 1973. We were hunting Stratford Bog in Coos County, which is one mountain west of the Nash Stream, Drummer Pond area. Stan and I were up at the end of an old logging road, now known as Gay Brook Road. At that time, the area was uncut with areas of dense pine along with mature hardwoods. About 2 p.m., Stan and I split for a nightstand and agreed to meet back at that logging bridge at 4:30 p.m. The day was cold, and when the sun set over Spruce Mountain, the temperature dropped fast. Starting to shiver, I left my stand early to warm up and got back to the bridge at 4:20. 4:30, 4:45, and no Stan. Finally, at 5 p.m., the glow of Hunter's orange appeared on the road at about 75 yards above me. Stan was walking rather fast, not like him, as he is a bigger guy. When he walked up to me, his eyes were wide open, and he had a strange look on his face. Stan said, "You wouldn't believe what I saw." And so I had asked what he had seen. "I saw this thing that was 7 to 8 feet tall, covered with hair and walking up the mountain." "A big bear?" I said. "And you didn't shoot it?" "It wasn't a bear," Stan said. "The thing was covered with hair. It had long arms and no neck. The head was right on top of its shoulders." Stan continued to say that this thing seemed drunk, like it has eaten a lot of fermented apples. "How long were you watching this thing?" "About 10 minutes, Stan said. I asked where it went, but he told me it went up and over the mountain. When we got back to camp, Stan told his story again and again to the other guys and really took some heat, ripping and everything else. However, it was obvious that Stan was upset and kept locking the camp door, something we never do. Next morning, our plan was to hunt the same area from front side to the back. Stan would have nothing to do with the area and stayed down low. I am still hunting the area and have not had another incident like this again. I will say, however, that we talked to many of the locals, and yes, 3 people confirmed sightings and 1 other talked about how large the tracks were that he found in an area called the Britches. In town at Emerson's Hardware, we talked to an employee named Junior, and he mentioned that there was an article in the local paper about something big and hairy roaming the area. However, he could not find this article. He did mention that the other locals had talked about it. Bigfoot, Yeti, or Wood Devil. Who knows? This is the way it happened.